Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, one of your hosts tonight. Mustapha Price, the Indie Game Movement producer, is another, and this is episode 113, where we're going to talk about what indie devs should make out of big events. Now, there's obviously a lot of big events that go around, whether it's PAX, E3, MAGFest, GDC, or any others. There's a lot of them, and whether you're an attendee, an exhibitor, or you're just following the event, we realize that there's a lot of things that people can be doing to make the most out of that event. So tonight, Mustapha and I are going to be talking about what exactly that is. So whether you are an attendee or an exhibitor or anything, or just simply following, we're going to talk about some quick tips on what you can do to make the most out of these events, so that way you can apply it to yourself and to your game, and how do you use that information to move forward. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, right here on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and like I said before, we're here with Mustapha. Mustapha, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I am doing great. It's a slightly balmy, I don't know what, like 75, 80 degree weather here in the Northeast, and same for you.
Yeah, definitely different from what we've been seeing.
Oh, yeah, it still felt like it was practically winter, but we're finally hitting summer now. So, winter, summer, that's how it works in the Northeast. So if you're not familiar with it, that can happen sometimes. But anyways, we are here to talk about some cool, interesting things. In particular, what indie devs should make out for big events. So Mustapha and I decided to change things up a bit, and we just kind of wanted to talk about this ourselves. I'm sure there's plenty of other people out there that can elaborate and provide some great insight about, hey, how do you make the most out of big events? But on top of that, we had some big recent events, in particular, E3 has been a big one, and we really figured that we should just get down to the core of it in terms of, hey, what do you need to do to make out of these big events? Whether you're attending them, whether you're an exhibitor, or whether you're just following them from outside of all those things because you just simply can't make it, or it's not that much of an interest, or whatever your reasoning is. So that's kind of what we want to talk about here. We were thinking about possibly doing a Q-Box run for us, because we realized prior to this that we've never done a Q-Box round, have we, Mustapha?
No, I don't think so.
No. Yeah, and, what we decided, ultimately, was we could ask ourselves the questions, but we don't necessarily feel that that's the right way to go about it, so we're going to leave that one up to you guys. So if anybody wants to reach out, I believe you could do IGM at rengenmarketing.com, or Mustapha at Rengen Marketing, or Andrew at Rengen Marketing. Feel free to shoot us emails regarding questions you want us to answer in a Q-Box round, and we will be more than happy to do that in the future. We might be a little bit selective with some of these questions, but otherwise we're completely open. So I think that would be fair, because otherwise we pretty much end up are the ones choosing these questions, and we'd rather have you guys do it. So,
yeah.
All right. So that would be fun, but let's get to the meat of the conversation here, which is what indie devs should make out of big events. So we kind of broke this down, as I kind of mentioned earlier, into like three main groups, which is if you're from an attendee perspective and an exhibitor perspective, and then from a neither perspective, but from that one, we're probably going to be focusing on more so around E3, but other big events that have happened recently, like GDC and other things in the past too. Because what we want to talk about, and especially what's been happening recently with things, is very much a game changer, pun not intended, for the industry as a whole. So that's where we're going to really focus most of our part. But we figured it'd still be important to talk about those other elements. So let's just take it from the top here, from an attendee perspective. Now, Mustapha, you've been going to events for a while now. I know I personally have been going to PAX for at least, I think, 8 years now. So between the two of us, I would say we've had some pretty good experience in terms of maybe offering some quick tips or hacks as far as going to events. So what are a couple on your end that you could offer to the rest of the community if they're going in, just trying to make the most out of an event?
Sure. I mean, I would say starting off, the most important thing that you can do is really, kind of gauge the tone of the event. And that is, to some degree malleable, right? I mean, if we kind of look at an event like E3, which has been, kind of dominated for the most part by the AAA, the way it kind of got its start was as a purely trade event, right? It was not necessarily what it is now, which is something where the public acts as spectators for these big, exciting announcements. It started out as business people talking to other business people. And so I think constantly being aware of the ever-evolving nature of our industry and the way that impacts the tone of certain events is key. I think to see highlight reels of indie games on big platforms like the Switch or the Xbox One, at an event that's really geared toward, what are considered the bigger annual releases, it's unheard of, which means that it's something that is continually subject to change. And so molding kind of your strategy for which events you attend and the types of booths you set up and the ways that you make your game accessible, I would argue that that's equally as important as the quality of the game itself, because it is kind of making use of what the audience of this event is already going to be looking for.
Yeah, I would say that's a real good one, because if you... Let's say it's like if your sole decision out of going to an event is like, oh, I know this is a big one, that's not necessarily going to cut it, because, like Mustapha said, like if you really gauge the tone of the event and who's it really targeting and everything else, that's going to give you a much better sense. In fact, I remember now from you saying this just now, when we were doing our couple episodes back, our PAX Roundup, there were people who, whether they mentioned it in the interview themselves or outside of that, they were simply saying like, hey, yeah, there was GDC too, but GDC is more business focused, right? For more directly relating to the industry as a whole, whereas other ones aren't. And that's one of the main reasons why they like going to PAX for them as an exhibitor, for example, because they got hands-on experience with like playtesters and essentially live active playtesters and emotions and really great feedback. And that's one of the reasons that they went there, in addition to exposure and things like that. So that was something we actually experienced too, just that they were calling out. But again, knowing the tone of the event is really important, because if you don't have that down or who it's intended for, then it can totally like throw off the rest of your game plan with an event.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not to say that like consumer-focused events are the only ones that benefit independent developers. I mean, like an event like GDC can still yield some incredibly positive results for you if you're trying to get your game out there. You can meet other teams, you can find other people who are working on things like you. And oftentimes for those more business-focused events, that's where a lot of kind of those publisher relationships can tend to start out because of how accessible they are. So again, it's not a matter of one over the other. It's a matter of making your approach to your marketing so modular that it can be applicable in any of these settings.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, too, because, I mean, you mentioned marketing, and I think a lot of times people will think, like, oh, marketing, that means, like, promoting my game. But it's not necessarily all about that. So to take it from another perspective, as an attendee, you might really want to go in, or I wouldn't say might, you definitely want to go into any of these events once you determine, which one is right for you to attend, is to go in with like a mission or make a game plan. And what that game plan is, it's not much different from a marketing plan. But it's essentially like, what's your purpose and intent? So if you're going to GDC and understand that it's more business focused, what's your intent of attending there? Are you going to talk to other teams? Are you going to try to reach out to some of those partnerships that Mustapha was referring to? What is it exactly that you're looking to do? And from those, so let's say that's your one plan, your one focus. That's really the best thing you could possibly do, because as we all know, and especially from my personal experience, and I'm sure Mustapha's as well, is you could go in and be like, oh, I know that there's this there, this there, this there, this there, and then next thing you know, you never get anything done because there's just so many fun and exciting things to do. And then you're like, wow, I feel like I got nothing out of that, even though it felt so awesome at the same time.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's overwhelming. All of these events can be overwhelming because there are a lot of people. That's just, and that's kind of the double-edged sword, right? You're there because you want to reach the audience, but that audience comes in numbers, so that has its own challenges.
Yeah, exactly. And what I don't think I expounded enough from when I mentioned about the marketing aspect, but it's the same thing as marketing yourself, not just your game, but also yourself, and that's where it's a key thing that really comes into those partnerships that Mustapha was talking about or referring a little bit earlier, because if you don't necessarily know how to market yourself, and it's not like you really need to do a whole lot with that, but market yourself. And what I mean by that in particular is, how do you represent yourself? How do you represent your brand? When you're going into talking to these partnerships, like let's say it's you want to get on a particular platform and you want to partner with someone from like Sony because you're thinking about going on PS4 or whatever the case may be, you need to know how to represent and market yourself and your brand, because those are things that they are looking for in addition to the quality of your game and everything else. Because just because you have a great and awesome game doesn't necessarily mean, obviously that's the big component behind it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to carry as the best kind of weight that it can if you don't know how to or if you don't have a set plan in mind when you're going to present yourself to these other entities and things like that. So that's why going in with the mission or making a game plan behind it, like how are you going to talk to these people? What do you already have done in place, and those types of things. So that's why I'm always a firm believer. For me personally, it's a little bit different when I go in with the mission plan or a game plan. But at the core of it, you just want to go down with a particular things you want to focus on, because, as I said, and as we agreed before, if you have too much on your plate, you're just going to get sidetracked and then feel like, oh, I don't know what really got done. So, another thing that I have in terms of an attendee perspective is simply just speccing out like talks and panels, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of great discussions and everything. And some might be more of, I don't know, just entertaining than necessarily adding value or outlooks or how you can get additional insight to doing things. But at the end of the day, you really need to know what those talks or panels are about in advance and then prioritize them. And sometimes it might also mean like you get caught up, you're talking to some other exhibitors and really getting involved in a conversation, then realize, oh, I just missed that panel. Like, make sure you're aware of which panels you absolutely have to go to and which ones you're like, it's okay if I miss that one. Yeah. Because if you set those expectations ahead of time, you're going to feel like you're getting a lot more out of the event than simply feeling or not checking those out, because there could be some very valuable ones that are top of mind for you if you don't go ahead and do that extra work in terms of figuring out what those things are before. And a quick follow-up to that, whether it's a panels or whether you're meeting certain people, and it all goes back to your mission or game plan, is know what questions you're going to ask up front. If you don't know what type of things you want to ask people up front, then it could be like completely open-ended, and once again, you could be it could be just a giant rabbit hole. And ultimately, as an attendee, that's what you want to try to avoid,